Enjoy it. I am a face in the crowd, above the majority, neither handsome nor ugly, just average. Women rarely notice people like me, but even a blind squirrel sometimes finds an acorn, and I found Jane. My life was perfect then, but fate grinned and said, "Just messing with you, buddy." I invited Jane to a party. She said she already had a date. I told her how much this bothered me. She laughed and said, "I agreed before I met you. It's FY Rose's annual party. I can't say no. Don't worry, it's just a social obligation." She kissed the phone and we hung up. The party was in full swing when I arrived, loud music and unrestrained dancing. The drunken fools were in full force, shamelessly drunk girls were everywhere. Predators were on the outskirts, scanning the herd. Hormones were seething, the atmosphere was sparkling, and all restraint was at zero. I heard loud male laughter and went over to see what was causing the commotion. It was Jane. She was so drunk that she couldn't stand. She had both arms wrapped around a frat boy's neck, her mouth open, her eyes closed, and her face relaxed. No doubt, it was her social obligation. It really shouldn't have bothered me. After all, we weren't married and we weren't officially engaged. Plus, Jane was not herself, but she behaved like a slut, and now I could never respect her. This realization caused intense feelings of anger and worthlessness. It was like I had invested everything only to find out that the advertising was false. My best friend Jane cornered me at a local diner. She tried to justify Jane in my eyes and deeply regretted it. I told her there was nothing to apologize for. We weren't monogamous, although everyone around us thought we were. I kept the bitterness out of my voice and said, "Jane doesn't have to worry about me anymore. I just want to move on." I lied, but there were a lot of lies. Jane's friend's face fell and she asked, "Is there a chance?" I replied, "Not the slightest." "You didn't see what I saw." She said, "I'll tell Jane, but it will kill her. She was completely and utterly in love with you." I said rudely, "It wasn't visible." Of course, I didn't just move on. It's hard to do when you're an average guy. I had a few dates, but they were nothing more than just meetings. There was never a second date, but this was not the case with Jane. Worse, I dated her from time to time. Every time I saw her, she gave me a look of shame. I tried to ignore her, but inevitably, I couldn't avoid it. It happened on the stairs in the library, just the two of us. Jane walked down the steps as I was going up. She stopped, hesitated, and said in a pained whisper, "Can I explain?" I looked at her as if she were an idiot and said, "There's no need to explain, Jane. I was wrong. I trusted you, and you made a fool of me. What's there to explain?" She said, "I'm so ashamed. It was just a mistake. It will never happen again." I said condescendingly, "I hope so. Now, please excuse me." I continued up the stairs. I heard a quiet sob behind me. I felt nothing but pity, humiliation, and despair. I had a teacher's license and found a job in the middle of Wisconsin. It was split between business and computer science. I also had an offer to become a coach. I played intercollegiate football, and the principal liked my experience. The consolidated district had approximately 700 students in kindergarten through 12th grade and served 3 small villages along US 12. The high school was in the town closest to Eau Claire. Teachers don't earn much, but it was a stable income with lots of free time in the summer, and I liked the kids. I completed my master's degree part-time in Madison, which increased my salary. I was also a varsity football coach, and the extra pay increased my income. We won more games than we lost. The locals thought it was quite a feat, as we were playing against bigger schools. I liked the respect, and it seemed right to settle here. The area was the center of the timber industry 100 years ago. The economy might be less prosperous now, but the houses still reflected former wealth. The streets were shaded by mature oak trees, and the houses were old and cozy. So, I bought one of them. The banker's son played on my team, so the mortgage was a foregone conclusion. It was a spacious 1.5-story craftsman-style home with a traditional Midwestern-style colonnade. The veranda ran along the entire facade. The wiring might have been scary and the plumbing antique, but the house had good wood materials and early 20th century craftsmanship. I spent a whole year turning it into what I wanted. It was both beautiful and cozy. I was proud of the shiny hardwood floors and oak paneling. When I was peeling a century's worth of cheap wallpaper off the walls, I discovered some exquisite cornices. Everything was idyllic, except for the fact that I had no social life. Meeting places in the area were churches and the Hot Spot Cafe. The Hot Spot was a legendary small-town spot. The owner, an old woman named, must have been a beauty in her youth because she was still a beautiful 70-year-old woman. Her daughter, whose name was Eva, was magnificent. Eva was a nurse and made up half of the district's medical team. Eva's husband was the other half. He was a licensed physician assistant. Together, they ran a local clinic. They had a resourceful 10-year-old daughter named Brooklyn. Miss Brooklyn had all the beauty of her mother and ruled the residents of the Hot Spot like the town's mayor. I loved having breakfast there. It was the perfect place to catch up on the latest news from the county. I devoured a plate of the legendary Swedish pancakes topped with lingonberry sauce. As I stared into Brooklyn's intelligent eyes, she studied me as if I were in a zoo. I pushed my plate towards her and said, "Would you like some?" She looked at me in disbelief and said, "Seriously? I already have as much as I want from my grandmother. She spoils me immensely." I wondered how a 10-year-old used the word immensely. I said in a conversational tone, "So, what happened?" Brooke looked at me and said, "My mom thinks you and my teacher should get married. She's trying to figure out what she sees in you." I laughed out loud and said, "Why does your mother care about my marital status?" Brooke said in a sympathetic voice full of intelligence, "How should I know? I'm just a little girl." I thought, aha, that's right, 10 years old and talking like a 40-year-old. What's all this with little girls and romance? I asked, "Who is your teacher, dear?" She said with conviction, "Miss Randall. She is old but still very beautiful." I thought, probably a wrinkled old lady of 24 years old. I replied, "I don't work at your school, honey. I work at the high school, so I've never met her." Brooke studied me with a frown and said, "You will. My mom is going to take you to dinner. You better be nice." I laughed again. Brooke was a real schemer. At that moment, her mother arrived. Eva was strikingly beautiful, even over 40. She had the perfect Swedish face that has supported the fashion industry for the past 60 years, but her body was not model thin. She had the lithe, full athletic figure you might see on an Olympic skier. Her hair was her best feature, exceptionally thick and blonde, styled in a chic, winged bob that framed her classic oval face. She appeared to be wearing a golden helmet. She said lovingly, "Brooke, how many times have I told you not to bother customers?" Brooklyn said in a condescending voice, "I was just telling Jake about Miss Randall." It was as if she were explaining something to a small child. Her mother gave me that long-suffering look that every parent of a gifted child has, turned to me, and said, "My husband and I were talking about inviting you and Penny Randall to dinner. It is difficult to meet like-minded people in rural areas." She smiled sadly and continued, "Penny is Brooke's 5th grade teacher, and I'm sure Brooke has already talked to Penny about you. So, would you like to join us for dinner this Friday?" It sounded painful. The absolute last thing I wanted to do was spend the evening getting to know someone as painfully sincere as a 5th grade teacher. But I liked Eva, so I said with fake enthusiasm, "Sounds great. What time?" Eva read my tone and said carefully, "How about 5:30? I know you'll enjoy meeting her." I understood what Eva was doing. Urban women are ordinary matchmakers, but she was wasting her time on me. It didn't matter whether I liked meeting this woman or not. The calculation of love is too complicated, with too many variables. A long time ago, I decided to quit the game. Maybe I'm not confident in myself, but I appreciate a safe bet over gambling. I didn't know this lady, so she was a risk, especially if she was beautiful. I believed Jane when she said she didn't go to the party to act like a slut. In an alternate universe, she could have walked away from the party. Everything depended on the coincidence of a temporary set of conditions. Unfortunately, things ended differently. This terrible sight caused me to remain lonely for a very long time. Despite this, I showed up at exactly 5:30. I tried to dress casually, sweater and trousers. I didn't want to seem impatient. I had a bottle of good Cabernet under my arm and flowers for the hostess. Her husband met me at the door. He was the local equivalent of the town doctor. He was a small guy compared to me, maybe 5 feet 10 inches and 190 pounds, barely taller than Eva. But there was something in his demeanor that told me he was more than just a kindly small-town healer. He moved like a stalking forest cat. He was wearing a polo shirt with one of those little crocodiles on it and jeans. I could see that he was fit and strong, with overdeveloped forearms and the kind of eyes seen in Western marksmen. He was as attractive as Eva, dark and dangerous, with deep brown eyes, an unruly mop of nut brown hair, and a thick mustache. I saw that they were a perfect couple. We hadn't officially met, so I extended my hand and said, "Jake." He grabbed it with an almost crushing grip and said, "John." His wife appeared behind him. I handed her the flowers and wine and said, "Thank you for inviting me, Eva." The smells coming from the kitchen were delicious. Then a small cannonball flew by and hit me in the stomach. I said, "Ugh," when Brookie put her arm around my waist. She said excitedly, "Miss Randall isn't here yet, so you can play with me until she comes." Eva looked condescendingly at Brookie and said, "I think he wants to play with adults, not with you." Miss Brooks said dismissively, "He'll have plenty of time to play with you guys after I show him what I have in my room." It was obvious that the strong personalities belonged to the female line of the family. I took her hand and said, "Why don't you show me your room, honey, and then I can spend the rest of my time with Miss Randall. You do remember that I'm here to meet your teacher, right?" Brookie gave me one of those stunningly dull looks and said, "Right, I forgot. You'll have to hurry up," and pulled me away. It never occurred to her that I didn't want to go. Brooke had installed something like the bridge of the Starship Enterprise in the corner of her room. She had 3 monitors and was working on a 3D animation app in which rabbits jumped from one screen to another. I asked how much of this she did herself. She proudly said, "All of this," and started showing me. This was impressive proof that she was a very smart little girl. While I was watching, she added the sound of some nasal singer who was wildly popular among teenagers. I said, "That's very impressive, Brookie. Maybe you should show the school kids how to do it." She looked disgusted and said with deep world weariness, "They won't understand this." Unfortunately, I agreed with her, which became the reason for my world weariness. I left the little genius while she added more colored bunnies and lizards and walked back to where the adults were. A new member had appeared in the group. Apparently, it was Penny Randall, and she took my breath away. She was a photographic negative of Eva. While Eva was tall, blonde, and athletic, Miss Randall was short, dark, and voluptuous. She had thick brown hair that fell in curls over her shoulders. Her shoulders were broad, and she looked powerful in her frame, 5 feet 2 inches. I approached her from behind and couldn't help but notice her beautiful muscular legs and 4-inch heels. Those legs stretched surprisingly far to a round, firm butt. But I almost fainted when she turned around. She had a heart-shaped face with perfect Anglo-Saxon features. Her eyes were unusually large and stunningly blue like porcelain, not the brown one would expect from her dark complexion. The discrepancy was striking. I walked up to the group and extended my hand. I said, "You must be Miss Randall. My name is Jake, and I work at a high school." She gave me a thoughtful look and said in a quiet, horror-struck voice full of irony, "Brooke told me everything." She added with a smile, "But I already know you from your team's exploits." I modestly said, "This is what the child does. I'm just looking after the kids." She laughed and said, "That's not what I hear. You are an inspiration." Well, it was a promising start. Eva was right. I found Penny Randall fascinating. Besides being amazing, she was smart, funny, and well-read. We exchanged stories about hiking in Europe and talked about all the places we had visited. I tried not to take my eyes off her neck, but from time to time, they dropped lower. The 2 large mounds moving under her elegant black cashmere turtleneck were objects of irresistible attention. This was more than a mortal man could bear. I asked Penny out for coffee the following Saturday, just to make sure she wasn't an illusion. She arrived at the hot spot wearing skinny jeans with rips and an authentic Wisconsin Badger football jersey. The jeans were probably $1,200, and the t-shirt looked real. I said, "Judging by your credentials, I'm guessing you graduated from UW." She said, "Yes. They're playing in Madison today, and I always dress for the game. I was a cheerleader all 4 years of high school, so it seems natural." I asked, "Is this a real Wisconsin jersey?" She modestly replied, "Yes. It was my ex-fiancé's. He played for them, now he's in the pros." She looked at me angrily and added, "We broke up because of an incident that happened at the end of our senior year." She wanted me to ask, so I asked, "I wonder if this was similar to the problem I had at the end of mine." She said regretfully, "That depends. If your best friend was involved, I'm never going to trust one of you cheaters again." I nodded significantly and said, "Me too." She looked at me strangely, smiled, and said, "So, we are two lonely castaways in the wilds of Wisconsin." I chuckled and said, "That's right." I had an idea. I asked, "Where are you going to watch the game?" She said, "I was thinking about going to Camp Randall. I can always get a ticket." I said, "Can you take two?" The journey took a couple of hours. We talked, laughed, and became close the whole way. Penny Randall had many virtues beyond the fact that she was built like a brick house. She was smart, funny, and, above all, a very balanced woman. Camp Randall Stadium was bustling when we arrived. This location is situated in the center of the University of Wisconsin campus, so close to 3 large lakes that it seemed almost maritime. We parked next to the Wisconsin Memorial Union and walked a few blocks to the special gate. Penny walked towards them boldly. Watching those big round but cheeks move was inspiring. People greeted her like a queen coming home. She said something to an older man who seemed to be the boss. He turned, beckoned me to follow him, and personally escorted us. It was obvious that Penny was well remembered from her cheerleading days. It made sense, she was a spectacular woman. I got a few looks from people wondering what the hell she was doing with me. We were ushered underneath the stadium to exit through an entrance into an area that seemed reserved for staff and dignitaries. We walked up a few steps to a couple of the best spots. I know that most visitors consider Wisconsin's atmosphere to be eccentric. This was fully demonstrated. The orchestra played Chicken Dance, not Sousa. Penny joined in as she probably had done hundreds of times while working in the fields. People came up to say hello. I just stood there, invisible. Penny turned to me, delight written all over her beautiful face, and said, "Thanks for coming with me. This is the most fun I've had since I left." She hugged my hand, her strange blue eyes sparkling on her dark face. Then they suddenly became hard and angry. I was a little stunned until I noticed they were focused on someone standing behind me. I turned around, and there was a guy who I was sure was the ex-fiancé. He was a big guy with that look that just screamed superiority. He looked at Penny possessively, gave her a big smile while looking right through me, and said, "Penny, what a wonderful surprise. Who would have thought you were here today? We had a break this week, and I wanted to watch the game. I see you're still wearing my number." His grin spoke volumes. Penny's reaction was amazing. She said with disgust in her voice, ignoring the guy, "Come on, Jake, we have to go." She grabbed my hand and began to angrily drag me towards the exit of the stadium. I was puzzled by her extreme reaction, but he followed her like a Pomeranian on a leash. A voice behind us said, rather annoyed, "Come on, Penny. It was a mistake. I told you so. It wasn't my fault, and it was just a night." As we disappeared out the exit, I could hear his voice saying, "I signed a new contract. You like money." Penny walked through the entrance, and we disappeared into the bowels of the stadium. Steam seemed to come from her ears. She didn't stop, still walking quickly until we reached the place where we had parked our car. I knew about the union from my own studies, so I offered to buy her a beer. She gave me the same angry look I gave people when they tried to comfort me after Jane. She said, "I don't want to talk about it. I hate this place and everyone in it." I thought to myself that her breakup had to be as bad as mine. I said, "Come on, I also have a story that I want to tell you." She stopped, looked interested, turned on her heel, and went out onto the terrace. I followed her, and we sat down at a table. She looked at me expectantly. The terrace is a special place, especially on a Saturday in the fall, the day of a football match. The atmosphere is exciting, the sun is beautiful, and the smell of fried sausages is mouth-watering. We ordered 2 large beers. I clinked the mugs and said, "Prost." She looked at me with pleasure. An attractive older couple sat next to us, holding hands. I noticed this because it was so unusual for older people. Penny looked over and said, "This is Professor Tyler and his wife, Sarah. He was a campus star when I was here. I heard through the gossip that his wife had an affair and they got divorced. Then they got married again." I said, "I would never put up with that. Why did they even get married again?" Penny looked at me strangely, as if I had said something out of character. She said, "I heard that they got divorced because of the intention, not because of the act itself. She was caught in a compromising situation with some married man. She never followed through with anything, but the fact that she had feelings for this guy was enough reason for him to leave her." Penny thought for a moment and said, "Then he seemed to change his mind. I don't know what influenced him, but they got married again a couple of years after the divorce and lived happily ever after. I think they both learned from their mistakes. 10 years on, their marriage seems to be stronger than ever. Sometimes you don't appreciate what you've lost until it's gone." I said disapprovingly, "Well, good for them. It's very romantic, but I'm not as forgiving as he is." Then I added curiously, "It looks like you're not like that either." A storm flashed across her beautiful face. I could see that she had a lot of passion inside her. She said, "If you mean that idiot who just kicked us out of the stadium, you're right. Sorry you missed the game." At that moment, a loud, enthusiastic cheer was heard in the distance, adding an exclamation point to what she had just said. I replied lightly, "I'm a football coach. Why should I worry about the exalted rugby you colonials play?" She laughed and said, "You probably figured out by now that he was my ex-fiancé. We were together for 4 years. I loved him, he was everything to me. Then I caught him in bed with my ex-best friend. I just walked in, stupid, and there they were." Penny's gaze was intense. She continued, "Linda told me she was just testing him. He was a football hero, and there were rumors among all the girls that he was great in bed. Linda told me he had been cheating on me all this time, but I was too naive and gullible to notice." I said, "Well, that explains the reaction. You have to understand that not all of us are like that, right?" She looked at me with real affection and said, "I'm starting to understand. Give me a little time, and I might believe it." Then she stopped, looked at me seriously, and asked, "So what's your story?" I said, "It's the same old story. I was in love with a beautiful girl. She was the first and only woman I ever fell in love with. Maybe I was a little too keen, but she was my whole life. Then she went to a party with someone else. She said it was just a social obligation. She got drunk and made a mistake. She told me she didn't know what she was doing, and I believed her. She said it would never happen again, but it did. I saw with my own eyes, and there was no turning back from that vision." Penny put her hand on my arm, even mimicking my tone, and said, "You have to understand that we're not all like that, right?" I smiled wryly and said in her own voice, "I'm starting to understand. Give me a little time, and I might believe it." We were 2 people with serious trust issues starting to find a common language. The couple next to us got up from their table and walked away holding hands. Penny looked at them and said, "Trust doesn't come easy. You build trust brick by brick over time." These 2 built a strong bridge over past hurts. It must have been difficult given the lingering feelings of hurt, betrayal, and abandonment. But both of them knew what they wanted and did everything possible to get it back. Then she gave me a thoughtful look and said, "Maybe we can build something like that too." This was very good news because I started thinking about Penny Randall as the one. It wasn't just her amazing appearance, in fact, her beauty was rather a disadvantage. Jane was just as attractive, and that only made her a bait for all predators. This is the hot woman paradox. Every man wants a beautiful wife, but you are constantly aware that every other man wants her too, especially if she is strikingly beautiful. So your wife's personal integrity is critical. Stripping away the floral decorations, marriage vows are simply a promise to do the right thing. People confirm their commitment by swearing to keep one another in sickness and in health and rejecting all others. But intimacy is fun, and the thrill of the chase is intoxicating. This can cause normally decent people to make bad choices. Resisting temptation requires strength of character. That's why qualities such as honor and self-discipline are so important in a spouse. Jane's problem was that she had no self-control. I knew other guys would keep coming even after we got married, and I was convinced that she did not have enough moral strength to resist. Penny was more solid, practical, reserved, and much less impressed by her own beauty. I thought to myself, maybe I can develop some trust in her. I drove Penny to her house. She wrapped her arms around my neck and kissed me on the mouth. She was completely in the moment with me. She said, "I am a traditional girl, so I am not inviting you in, but I will wait for your call. You will not be disappointed." I wasn't disappointed. I called her the next morning, bright and early. She sounded as if she had been waiting for this call, smart little fox. I said, "It's a beautiful day, honey. How about a winery tour to make it better? The Dells has several decent wineries." The plan was to move down US 90, stopping at each on the way to Prairie du Sac and its winery across the Wisconsin River. This would allow us to visit 5 interesting places. She said, every syllable dripping with innuendo, "Oh sir, I hope you're not trying to get me drunk." I laughed and said, "Anything for that." She said, "Pick me up at noon, and we'll have a great day." She appeared on the porch as soon as I arrived at her house. She must have been standing by the window. She came down the steps, and I have to say she was jumping with excitement. There was an expression of pure delight on her gorgeous face. She wore a modest cotton pinafore dress with a drawstring top that had a built-in bra. There was no obvious attempt to show off her breasts. She had a light knitted scarf on her shoulders and wore cork sandals with a 2-inch heel. The extra 2 inches accentuated her muscular calves, small ankles, and raised her to a formidable 5 feet 4 inches, making her exactly a foot shorter than me. I drove a Jeep Wrangler, and it was a gorgeous Indian summer day, so I removed the panels, and we were exposed to the elements. Normally, a woman dressed like Penny wouldn't want the wind blowing around her, it could ruin her hair, but I quickly learned that Penny was an unbridled wild creature in a convertible. As soon as we left for US 90, she raised both her arms in the air, screaming, "Woo!" I think it was at that moment that I fell madly in love with her. The problem with winery tours is that you drink a lot of wine, so we were both more or less drunk by the time we left the last tasting. It was obvious that any attempt to drive would be dangerous to our health and my driving record, so I booked a room for us at a local hotel. Thanks to all the wine, Penny was completely obedient. I thought she might want to come back once she sobered up, but just in case, I took a room with 2 beds. We dragged each other into the room, laughing like idiots. She swayed unsteadily toward the window, drew the curtains, and turned to me, muttering, "I need to get out of this dress." Before I could say anything, she was standing in front of me in her cork sandals and lingerie. It was perhaps the most impressive sight since the opening of Mount Rushmore. The only way to describe her was tough. She was only 5 feet 2 inches, but she had spent her entire life dancing and cheerleading. All these gymnastic movements had created a strong female body. She had broad shoulders, a flat stomach, a narrow waist, wide and toned hips, and full, muscular legs. But the main attention was drawn to her breasts. They could look proportionate on a taller woman, but Penny was essentially a fragile girl, so her breasts dominated her entire upper body. Such abundance was difficult to comprehend, so I stood there like an idiot. She looked at me blankly and said, "I thought you wanted to rest." Then she bent down, pulled back the blanket on her bed, and settled under it. I took off my shirt and started to climb into the other bed, wearing only my jeans. She looked at me like I was an idiot, patted the spot next to her, and said, "No, here, you idiot, and take off your pants." On the way, I lay down next to her, hesitated, because I was trying to hide my raging boner. She turned her back to me, pressed her butt against me, sighed, and relaxed. I ran my loving fingers through her hair as she lay there recovering. I said, "I didn't plan this." She replied, "Me too, but I lost my head as soon as I felt you on the threshold." I said seriously, I wanted to approach this slowly because I'm starting to have deep feelings for you, and I didn't want to scare you. She said, "You don't have to worry. I already know that I have feelings for you, and from now on, I'm yours." I said, "So have we come to an understanding?" She replied, "If you're asking if I love you, the answer is yes." I said, "That's good because I love you so much that I can't imagine life without you." The day that followed was perhaps the most intense intimate of our entire life together. Yes, I say life together because our wedding took place in a small Lutheran church 4 months after that Sunday. 4 months is a short courtship period, but after that glorious Sunday in September, there was no doubt. She moved in with me the following week. Literally overnight, I went from distrusting everyone to complete confidence in the other person. This had to be the dumbest thing I've ever done in my life, but I did not doubt my decision. We had an unfathomably deep and instant connection. Neither of us had much family, so Eve and Dot organized the wedding. Penny rightfully broke off relations with her friends when she found out that most of them had slept with her fiancé. That's why Eve was a bridesmaid. I had no friends at all. I cut them off after the Jane disaster. Being humiliated makes a person do this. I had friends among the teaching staff, but it seemed appropriate to ask Eva's husband to be a witness since they were the people who brought us together. Brooke was the only bridesmaid. She looked incredibly grown up in an outfit that matched her mother's. All of Penny's 5th grade students and their families were there. My whole team was there too. We are both teachers, so we had to postpone our honeymoon until the summer holidays. It was traditional, so I took her to Tamarindo in Mexico. She sunbathed in a skimpy bikini, with her exquisite little body attracting lustful glances from cowboys. However, she was mine and made a point of showing it through little touches and loving glances. I couldn't understand how I got so lucky. Married life was easy. The advantage of 2 teachers being married is that they have plenty of time to do what they want, and our combined salaries were significant, so we were well off. Neither of us were outdoor enthusiasts. We preferred to read good books and discuss them over a glass of brandy. We left kayaking and skiing to Eva and her husband. Our main hobby was spending time together. We traveled during the holidays, went on cruises, and even rented an RV one summer for an extended RV vacation. Days merged into months and months into years. Neither of us wanted children. We had a new batch of students every year, and we were always enough for each other. It was good enough for both of us. 9 years later, I became the district's athletic director, and Penny became the principal at her school. I had come further in life than I ever imagined, which was mostly due to the strength I drew from our marriage. No matter what storms I might encounter on the high seas, I knew I always had a safe harbor to return to. It was an article of faith. Moreover, I never doubted Penny's loyalty. Penny tried to prove it. Truth be told, she probably tried harder than I did. I always saw a happy face when I came home. I usually arrived a little later than her due to the extracurricular aspect of school sports, but Penny always cooked dinner, true, and without complaint. Like most married couples, Penny and I liked different things. We understood that our individual interests would keep us apart, therefore, we tried to organize our time in such a way as to make the most of the time spent together. I was involved in sports both as a coach and on their board. I also played senior amateur soccer with my Hunt teammates. There are a lot of Germans in this part of Wisconsin. In fact, half the team seemed to speak German or Swedish. I was a nobody in college, but we all lost a step, and at 6 feet 4 inches, I dominated the air, so I was a bit of an outlier among the old-timers. For most of the summer, we had games on Sunday afternoons and practice one evening a week. We played in Keller Park, which is next to the small stream that gives the town its name. It was close to home. Penny sat faithfully and watched. This wasn't Camp Randall, and I wasn't destined for the NFL, but her presence told me how devoted she was to me. On the other hand, Penny was born to be in public. She could stand on the sidelines with 20 other cheerleaders, and she would be the one who got your attention. She was so charismatic. She danced for many years before spending 4 years performing in front of 880,000 adoring fans, so it seemed natural that she would get involved in amateur theater. The theater company Penny joined was 20 minutes away in Eau Claire. She did not participate in every performance, but when she did, she was gone from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. 3 days a week. Sometimes she even stayed late for additional rehearsals. She always got small roles, mostly when they needed a dancer, but one day she came home glowing. She said, "I have wonderful news. They're doing a revival of Tea and Sympathy, and guess who they want to play the lead?" I said with fake enthusiasm, "Sofia Vergara? Jennifer Lawrence?" She hit me and said, "No, stupid. Me." I was happy for her. Eau Claire is not Broadway, but it was the largest city in the area, and it gave my wonderful wife the opportunity to prove herself in front of a large audience. To be honest, I had never heard of the play before. I should have studied it in college, but I didn't remember anything about it. So, I did what any good nerd would do. I searched on Google. The story was the usual 1950s nonsense about otherness. This was the Eisenhower era when men were men and women were June Cleaver. The leading men of the time were uber macho men such as John Wayne, Randolph Scott, and Rock Hudson. Fortunately for the film industry, one of them had no reason to immigrate, and the other two did not speak French. I felt a little uneasy when I read the synopsis. Tea and Sympathy is about a guy who is cultured, gentle, and sensitive. These qualities would make him popular with women today, but in the 1950s, such effeminate behavior led to scorn, ridicule, and frequent beatings. His main antagonist is a macho man who runs the school's dormitory. In modern terms, he could be called a sociopath, but in the 1950s, he was the leader of the pack. The long-suffering wife spends the entire play trying to get him to act a little less like a jerk, but real men don't change their habits. So, using classic feminine logic, the wife ends the play by having a night with the guy just to somehow help him get back on his feet, so to speak. No need to say who the director saw in this role. I'm not someone who stands in the way of artistic expression, but I also wanted to know how far Penny would have to go to sell a happy ending. This question had to be asked with subtlety because it would be completely wrong to show that I doubted her fidelity. The easiest way to do this was to be casual, so at dinner I said, "How are rehearsals going? Don't you talk about them?" She smiled and casually replied, "We've read the text a couple of times and are working on the basic movements. They're starting from the beginning, so they haven't gotten to me yet." I said casually, "I heard that there is a hot scene at the end, even some simulated intimate. How are you going to deal with this?" She frowned and said, "I don't know." Ron spoke about this only in general terms. He said that John and I would have to convince the audience that something was really happening, otherwise, they wouldn't get the point of the play. My heart sank a little. Then she brightened up and said, "It's a little awkward knowing that I have to act like I'm having an intimate with a guy 10 years younger than me, but at least I have one last line." Her manner had changed. She said in a low, sensual voice, "Many years from now, when you remember this, and you will, be kind." She looked at me impatiently, as if the Labrador had brought the bird and was waiting for approval. I clapped my hands and said, "Bravo." Her ability to transform into another person amazed me. My beautiful wife, the woman I've known and loved for almost 10 years, had just shown serious acting chops. I said with a big fake smile on my face, "Is this where the night starts?" She replied, "As far as I'm concerned, we're supposed to leave the audience with the idea that he finally has his first intimate experience. The whole storyline is built around him failing the first time. That's why he plans to kill himself." I continued to remain calm. My false calm even amazed me. I said, "Wow, that sounds intense. Are you really going to kiss?" She laughed and said, "Oh, I'll have to do a lot more than that." I just sat there looking at her carefully. My heart was pounding, trying to escape from my chest. My ability to hide my current feelings was a tribute to my acting abilities. She looked a little confused and said, "I don't know what Ron is up to. He's unorthodox and says the original ending is outdated." I said with growing apprehension, "What does this mean?" She sighed tiredly, as if she was weary of thinking about it. "He says that the ending is limited by 1950s morality and that it needs to be updated to make it believable." I didn't like the tone of this. I continued to try to keep my tone of voice calm. "So, what are you going to do? More than just kiss?" She said, "I'll find out when we get to the final scene." I must have looked worried because she added, "In the movie, she saves him from committing suicide by giving him one night of passion. I think Ron wants us lying down, not standing by the tree." That's how it was in the theatrical cut. It happens on the golf course. I tried to sound casual when I said, well, tell me how it goes. This is your big stage, right? She nodded. I said, I know you'll win the room no matter how Ron decides to play it. Then we moved on to other topics. There was no point in raising my blood pressure any higher. This whole horrific situation just sat there, staring at me like a vulture on a tree. I've often wondered how Hollywood types tolerate their significant others having a night for the sake of art. I was absolutely sure that Penny wouldn't understand why her acting would make me feel uncomfortable in any way. She loved me, we both knew it, and she had no intentions towards her scene partner, John. I'd never met John, but the director was a different matter. I met him at other theater events 30 years ago. A guy who starred in a forgotten film now works in the drama department of UV, and because of this, he considered himself at the top of the food chain among the enlightened of Eau Claire. I've met him before, and in the dictionary under pompous, expletive, it says, see him. I had a feeling his raging ego would give him great satisfaction. Honestly, the thought of Penny in a passionate embrace with another man was killing me. Whether it's just pretending or not, the thought of another man kissing her lips and holding her magnificent body threw me into fits of burning jealousy, especially since she had to pretend to have an intim with him. I knew it wasn't real. I knew she was completely committed to me. I knew they would probably find a way to keep everyone fully clothed. This is still rural Wisconsin, damn it. But at the same time, I also knew that they would probably be exchanging languages and that she would have to sound convincing, so to speak. It was stable for a month before the premiere. There was no change in her attitude towards me or in her general mood. In fact, if one were to describe her behavior during that period, she looked more like a primary school principal than a theatrical fatalist. It never occurred to me that she didn't do exactly what she said she did in the theater. That's because she called me just to chat when she wasn't needed on stage. Finally, the premiere night arrived. It was one of those breathtaking, beautiful days in Wisconsin. Penny and I had dinner at the hot spot before she headed to the theater. Penny had a lot to do to prepare for that evening's performance, so I had to get dressed and arrive later. She was excited and incredibly nervous, which was new to her. I said, trying to calm her down, don't worry. You'll steal the show. She smiled at me anxiously and said, I just want the first evening to pass. The anxiety will subside once I get over it. But pretending to be someone else for 2 hours straight is a surreal and very intense experience. It's like you're sleepwalking. I said, I've never done anything like this, so I can't really compare. But if it's any consolation, your biggest fan will be sitting right in the front row. I know you'll play Laura Reynolds better than Deborah Kerr. She did what women do when their emotions are disturbed. She took my hand and said, our love is the most precious thing I have. It makes everything possible. It will always be just you and me. She looked at her watch and said, I have to go, but I'll see you at the artistic entrance right after the performance. It was opening night. I got dressed and headed to Eau Claire. The theater parking lot was full, so I parked at the bank across Cheapa and walked across the bridge. It was much easier than fighting for a spot on the other side of West Grand. Eau Claire is a big city, so none of the theatergoers knew me, and vice versa. I wore my premiere suit, which oddly enough was also my only suit. Theater is not the main attraction in my part of the state, hunting and fishing are, but culture is not very prominent. However, I felt like a real intellectual when I was escorted to my place in the Ring of Honor. Penny got me a ticket, and this was undoubtedly where the great and good of Eau Claire sat. The woman next to me was obviously one of the local venerables. In addition to carrying enough gold to replenish the reserves of Montezuma's temple, she was chatting about the theater with an older man sitting next to her. I assumed he was her husband because he completely ignored her. It didn't matter whether the husband listened or not, the woman's goal was to demonstrate to everyone around her that she was cultured and they were not. As soon as I sat down, she turned to me with excitement. Have you seen this play before? I don't like chatting with strangers, but I had time and was nervous about the grand finale, so I said, no, I've never actually been to that theater. It was an invitation for her to tell me stories about all the performances she had seen, past and present. She said, Ron Woods is a dramatic genius, and the 3 stars of the show are brilliant. I assumed that included Penny, so I said, thanks. One of them is my wife." My seatmate said doubtfully, "Are you married to this beautiful woman?" I humbly replied, "They tell me that often." The woman said, "She is a dazzling talent, so deep and significant you'll be shocked by the final scene." The poor unsuspecting woman had no idea how excited I already was by the final scene. I tried to sound sophisticated when I asked, "Were you at the dress rehearsal last night?" She giggled and said, "Of course, I go to every production here." I thought to myself, this woman really needs a life. Then she said something that completely baffled me. She said, "You will be very proud and impressed. Your wife brings true integrity to her performance." What the hell did that mean? I almost said it out loud. Instead, I mumbled in a slightly choked voice, "This is a difficult scene for her." My seatmate patted my arm patronizingly and said, "Yes, that's right, but she's so convincing." I hoped she didn't mean what I thought she meant, but at that moment the hall went dark, and I turned to the stage to ponder my fate. The play was pretentious nonsense, a collection of dusty studies of masculinity that might have been considered insightful in the 1950s. I had heard some of the dialogue while helping Penny with her lines, but listening to the actors spout all this tired nonsense was excruciating. The guy must have been chosen because he was small and effeminate, as the script described. His skin was so pale that it was almost transparent. He had a thin mustache and a thick head of light brown hair, but he was a very talented actor. I didn't like the character he portrayed, but then again, in the 1950s, gloom and self-pity were in vogue. He conveyed these emotions so convincingly that it made me wonder if he was like that in real life. The man looked like a truck driver. This was understandable, as there are few people in Eau Claire with elite school educations. However, his performance was very convincing. I hated this character. He was a bully. The actor perfectly conveyed the essence of his character. You felt that his character could be charismatic in the locker room and that there was real fear in his soul. And then there was the love of my life. The other actors were good, but she was the shining one. The character she portrayed was a woman of sensitivity and intelligence, marginalized by the society in which she lived. It was obvious that she did not love her husband, perhaps never did, a complete cultural mismatch. She was neglected and often reminded that her only purpose in life was to serve tea and sympathy. Penny's interpretation was heartbreaking. From the moment she walked on stage, you could feel her desperation, the claustrophobia that an intelligent and complex person might feel if she found herself in an impossible situation. It was clear that her character was emotionally invested in the fellow outcast. You could see that she was not so much falling in love with him as trying to save him from his abusers, the worst of which was her husband. You could also see how she realized her own victimhood and gained personal strength to face life. I just sat there in amazement as the play went on. I had no idea Penny had so much depth. I think everyone underestimates their spouse, but Penny's performance was so strong that it was frightening. She reached the penultimate scene where she finds the guy's suicide note. She was smart enough to control her reaction instead of resorting to melodrama. She walked off stage with determination in her eyes. Her determination perfectly anticipated the events that were to follow and changed the meaning of her role. She was not drawn into night by lust, she was a woman with a mission. I had dreaded the final scene for 6 weeks. There was a brief kiss a couple of scenes ago. It was a PC, but it still caused a sharp pain of jealousy. Now she was going to turn him into a man. Knowing what she planned to do, I almost forced myself not to get up and leave, but I was there for Penny and needed to be strong. The set was built on multi-level platforms. In front, in the center of the stage, there was a low platform that almost jutted into the first row of seats. The director clearly wanted to stick the drama in everyone's faces, so all this would happen less than 20 feet from where I was sitting. The stage was darkened while filming a scene in the dark. Someone was fidgeting, then a single spotlight came on, illuminating an 8-foot radius around the child with a bright white light. The set included an illegible bench and a ball puck, dimly lit by searchlights, just enough to suggest it was a golf course. The platform was covered with green artificial turf, and the guy was lying on a blanket in the middle of the platform. He lay on his side facing us and convincingly sobbed in shame. Penny then took center stage to the left of the stage. She stood and looked down at him. Her beautiful face radiated love and compassion. She wore a 1950s Betty and Veronica-style gray cashmere sweater with the requisite string of pearls. However, her stunning breasts were highlighted by a 21st-century bra. This magnificent spectacle caused slight excitement in the hall. She was wearing a pleated rayon skirt that must have been the focus of the gang's attention at the soda fountain. Her wonderfully muscular legs were accentuated by seamed nylons and boxy heels that were so popular after World War II. I realized that the only way to hold those in place was with garters, and that took my anxiety level up a notch. She lay gracefully in the classic female resting position, with the leg in the background lying flat and the leg in the foreground bent at the knee. Her face was the center of our attention. She started talking while lying on her back. I couldn't take my eyes off her gorgeous lips as she began her final speech. The audience was silent. All you could hear was Penny saying, "Years from now, when you remember this, and you will, be kind." She then carefully reached out and guided his right hand to her left breast. To do this, he had to position his upper body over hers. You could hear her breath catch, and then she sped up. He leaned in, and her mouth opened wide. They exchanged a kiss with growing passion as the spotlight began to dim. Then he moved lower, her hips swayed, her legs lifted, and she let out an incredible sound just as the stage went pitch black and the curtain slammed shut. For a long time, there was absolute stunned silence. Then the audience went wild, jumping to their feet, screaming, whistling, and clapping their hands. Several minutes passed, and the applause continued to grow. Then the curtain parted again. The extras announced the curtain call for the whole group, and then the actor who played the husband came out. I heard a loud cry of "Dad" from a little girl sitting a couple of seats to my left. He looked in her direction, smiled sweetly, and waved. This was a completely different person than the one I had been observing. Then the child and Penny came out holding hands. He looked a little worse for wear, which is what a moment with Penny can do to any man, but he accepted congratulations. Penny was embarrassed by this reception. It was overwhelming flattery. It was clear that viewers thought she stole the show. She bowed, then looked in my direction and smiled, seeking approval. To my eternal regret, I did not react. I just sat and looked at her, devastated. The last moments of this scene took me back 11 years to that terrible party. I remembered exactly what I was thinking then, and I felt the same now, complete and utter despair. I saw that Penny was embarrassed. She looked at me pleadingly. Then she abruptly turned her back and slowly walked off the stage. My rational mind was screaming, "Come on, this is a play." She was acting for God's sake, while my gut was screaming, she just had a night in front of 300 people. Everyone heard her breathing quicken. She kissed. It's impossible to pretend like that. She must have felt it. My rational self chuckled and said, "Seriously, I knew you were insecure, but I didn't think you were that stupid. You have to be a complete narcissist to think that Penny's actions reflect on you." I knew it was right. Deep down, I knew that I was confusing what was happening here and now with something that happened 11 years ago. I suddenly felt very ashamed of myself. Jane's behavior was humiliating because it was motivated by uncontrollable passion. Penny's actions were planned, rehearsed, and designed to drive home the central message of the play. Naturally, she put her heart and soul into selling this idea. Deborah Kerr did the same thing 712 times and then filmed it. Do you think anyone thinks she's A? She is considered one of the best female actors of her generation. Penny was just playing a role, so I should be proud of my wife's talent and not pout like some ignorant nerd. The actor who played her husband was not like his character. He was a family man and had a little girl. Of course, Penny's powerful performance was further proof of what an exceptional woman she was, which was also extremely worrying. I guess that's what really bothered me. How could someone as special as Penny be married to a nonentity like me? The lights came on in the house, people stirred, gathered their things, and began to walk down the aisles. I sat there like a hunted elk. The woman next to me grabbed my arm. She had tears in her eyes as she said, "She was brilliant, so honest, so true to her role. You should be very proud." I just looked at her without saying anything. She read my reaction as overwhelmed by my wife's talent, and that didn't make my situation any easier. Then my seatmate made her way down the row, leaving me exhausted. I began to slowly move up the aisle. I started to realize what I had just done and shuddered in horror. Penny had some truly wonderful success, and I ruined it by letting her see how irrationally jealous I was. It was so painfully childish and self-centered that I wanted to hit myself. I walked through the foyer and near the stage entrance. I just hoped I hadn't ruined everything. Significant others of the troupe stood with me, among them a sweet and resourceful little girl who belonged to Penny's husband. On stage, she told anyone who would listen what a wonderful actor her dad was. I wondered what such a young girl was doing at an adult show, but it was none of my business. Maybe they were trying to introduce her to the culture. I just hoped she was too young to understand what was going on around her. A couple of guys were waiting for a friend. They were obviously making fun of Penny, so I moved closer, trying not to look like I was eavesdropping. One of the friends said, "Can you believe he can touch those breasts?" Another said, "Darl told me she didn't let him do anything during rehearsals. They just talked about it. Dress rehearsal was the first time she let him touch her. She didn't even let him kiss her." The second guy said, "Well, he definitely did it. You saw how she reacted." I couldn't listen to it anymore. These two were too boring to endure, but the conversation helped me put the final scene in perspective. For anyone who has ever practiced intim, it was obvious that Penny had compressed the entire act into 15 seconds. I knew about Penny's intim preferences. She likes half an hour of foreplay to warm up rather than just a few seconds. At that moment, the young actor came out. There were a lot of high fives between him and his little buddies. One friend asked, "So she's that hot?" He replied with some bitterness in his voice, "She is incredible. She pushed me away the minute the stage went dark, but she has an incredible body." The child's words made me feel both better and worse. My rational brain knew that Penny was just doing what she needed to do. She undoubtedly met all the standards of proper stage behavior. The night perfectly conveyed the meaning of the play. Still, the thought of another guy kissing her drove me crazy. Of course, the fact that I was responding to fantasy rather than reality made me feel like the most naive homer in Eau Claire County. My inner voice said, "Dude, grow up." I knew Penny had 3 more shows and wanted her to be as real as she was tonight without worrying about her husband having fits of jealousy. So, I needed to deal with this problem as quickly as possible. The only way to do this was to talk to her about it. It's a fact, Penny is not just my wife, she is my life partner and my wisest friend. We always solve problems by talking about them, rationally and openly. Our communication is how we maintain a close and loving connection. Penny then walked out the door. She received another greeting, which she responded to with a smile and a modest wave of her hand. At the same time, she was desperately looking for me. I was closer to the door than she expected, and she looked past me into the crowd. I said, "Bravo, my love. You were simply magnificent," and began to applaud. She made a startled sound, turned around, and saw me standing almost next to her. Her face showed complete relief. She threw herself into my arms. I caught her and spun her around in a romantic swing. She put one hand on the side of my face, grabbed the back of my head with the other, and tried to devour me. She is only 5 feet 2 inches tall, so when we kissed, she was pressed against me, and her legs were hanging in the air a foot off the ground. This lasted for a full minute. The crowd laughed and applauded. I put her on the ground. We both breathed like locomotives. I said, "Let me buy you dinner. You must be hungry." She looked embarrassed and said, "Will you forgive me?" I replied, "There's nothing to forgive, but that's what I want to talk about." We crossed the bridge and drove a short distance across the Lake Street Bridge. Without saying much, I parked the car at the curb and walked into the restaurant, holding her hand. Mona Lisa is a top-class restaurant. You take a woman to a place like this on special occasions. In my mind, it was a very special occasion. I wanted to celebrate Penny's accomplishments while we worked through my problems. We sat down, and I ordered a nice bottle of Merlot. I like red wines with character. Penny prefers the sweeter variety, and this evening was hers. She sat opposite me, looking a little worried. My heart melted. She wore one of her signature spaghetti strap sundresses with a built-in bodice. This device raised her girlish breasts into 2 epic piles. Her bare shoulders were covered with her ubiquitous scarf, and her strikingly bright blue eyes searched me for answers. I poured the wine and proposed a toast. I said, "To the most wonderful actress in the world. I had absolutely no idea that you were so brilliantly talented." Her beautiful face melted. I could see how much she loved me in her eyes. I said cryptically, "Let me tell you a story." She looked at me puzzled. I continued, "I think I told you about my bad experience with my ex-lover." She replied, "Yes, she cheated on you." I said, "That's right, but it wasn't done behind my back. I almost wished it were. In fact, I was standing 40 feet away from her." Penny looked startled. She said, "I didn't know it was like that. I thought you just caught her like I caught Billy." I said, "I was humiliated. After that, I couldn't look people I knew in the eyes." Penny looked at me with a question, as if waiting for the story to continue. Then she suddenly sighed and covered her mouth with her hands in horror. She said, "Oh my God, Jake, you're comparing what I do in the final scene to that terrible past experience?" I just looked at her. She said, "I don't know what to tell you. You realize this was all an act, right? You know I'm playing a role, not actually betraying you. Please tell me you understand that." I looked at her lovingly and said, "I know it's just acting, but don't you feel anything?" She looked a little weary and said, "He smokes, so kissing him is kind of gross. Fake night is painful. He doesn't touch anything important, but the scene is hard on my back." I just opened the door a little to add realism to the scene. She then looked shocked and hastily added, "It doesn't mean anything except that I like the feeling. I'm not giving myself to him. I don't have feelings for him. In fact, he's an annoying jerk behind the scenes, but there's no denying that I must sell intimacy with him for a very short time each performance." She looked straight at me and said, "I understand it's really just as difficult as if you were doing it the other way around, but as far as people can imagine, I'm doing something more than acting. I'm sorry for what I did to you because what you think is crazy." This statement strengthened our position. I said, "I love you. I will always love you. I know I mixed things up, and honestly, I'm strong enough to get through it. That is, if you promise to wear a full chain-mail suit in your next role, perhaps in St. Joan." She laughed her deep, guttural laugh. "This is the blood of the Celts and Italian Ions," Penny said, not hiding anything, even her laughter. She was mad that night. I had a feeling that her little interlude on stage had gotten her going. She became completely wild. I realized that we had completely reenacted the scene she had played earlier that evening, whether planned or not. She gave me her fully focused look and said with a secret smile, "I hope you noticed the difference." The next evening, I sat in the front row. The situation was almost the same. In fact, I was sitting next to the same woman. She said she was so moved by Penny's performance that she had to watch it again. God, this woman really needed a life. However, Penny was just as brilliant as last time. The play moved quickly toward the final scene, but this time I didn't cringe in anticipation. I enjoyed the reflection of my wife's talent. The scene began the same as the day before. Penny lay down next to her, conveying her love and compassion. When she said her line, "Be kind," you saw her character completely evolve from a timid housewife to a woman in control. Unlike last night, I didn't pay much attention to the action on stage. There was a reception for all the major donors after the show, and I enjoyed the pleasure of accompanying the star of the show. My lack of attention to simulated intimacy was a tribute to how far I had come. Penny made the same movements with her partner's hand to her left breast, inviting intimacy. It was obvious that the pace of the scene had slowed down. Penny let out a gasp of surprise. Her head fell back, she looked confused. It was as if she suddenly woke up from a dream and found herself in front of 300 people. Then she seemed to realize that she had to see the role through to completion. She pulled him sharply into a passionate kiss, as if trying to get back to the right pace. Penny made a sound loudly in time. This was the moment when the curtain was supposed to fall, but they were still kissing. Meanwhile, the blackout dragged on too long. All the while, Penny's eyes were closed, her mouth wide open, and her face began to contort into a mask of passion as the stage plunged into complete darkness. The ominous sounds continued for several seconds in the darkness. It was the hottest thing I've ever seen. Everyone in the audience thought it was incredible acting, but I knew better. This was Penny at her extreme. As on the previous night, the audience initially sat in stunned silence, then burst into applause so loud that I couldn't hear anything around me. The curtain parted, the supporting cast bowed, and just like last night, Penny and her partner walked out holding hands. Penny looked confused. "You asked what I was doing during this time?" "I was deciding whose fifth place to kick first." Last night's scene lasted 10 to 15 seconds, this one was closer to 3 minutes, and it clearly wasn't an accident. Penny was ambushed, and someone would pay for it. We were going to a snobbish night at the Theater Guild. Penny was all dressed up. As she emerged from backstage wearing 4-inch heels and a tight black cutout dress, she looked amazing. She is not the kind of person who prefers a formal style. In fact, I only see her dressed like this for our anniversary and New Year's. But tonight was the most significant cultural event in Eau Claire County. No need to tell me Eau Claire culture is an oxymoron, but today was the best we had. I stood right in front of her with the most loving expression on my face. It was a waste of time. Her Irish temperament flared up. She walked past me towards her partner, who was grinning at her and surrounded by his friends. There was fire in her eyes, and it wasn't the cheerful kind. I knew I needed to prevent confrontation because the ensuing fight would reveal to the world that Penny was not playing at the top. I grabbed her hand and said, "Later. Let's do some planning first." I then directed her across the street to the courthouse bar and grill. It seemed at every step we fit into the place like two cats at a dog show, but I wanted to cool her down and find out the whole story. I ordered 2 beers. We both prefer wine, but who knows what third world country the homemade red wine came from. As soon as we sat down, she said, "Did you see what that idiot did?" I couldn't make a fuss right in the middle of the stage. I said sternly, "I know, but people thought it was just part of the play." I was the only person who knew the difference, unless you were entertaining someone else in the audience. She hit me hard. Then she looked at me with horror. She put her hand on my arm and said with real concern in her voice, "You don't think I did it on purpose, do you?" I said, "No." The scene took 10 times longer than yesterday. I added, "It would be terribly awkward for both of us if you made it clear what really happened. It's not part of the action. Don't worry, I understand, and I think you made the right decision in bringing the scene to a thrilling conclusion, so to speak." I winked at her mischievously. She slapped my arm in anger and said, "Don't be a jerk. It's my body, and I choose who I give it to." She said, "I'm sure it's all because of Ron Woods." The girl had a sharp tongue when she was angry. She said, eyes blazing, "In my opinion, that was unacceptable, and I'm not going to put myself in that situation again." I quickly said, "No, don't do this. You've been a huge success. I don't want you to throw it all away." She hit me again. I said with an ominous hint in my voice, "I'll make sure everything goes well for the rest of the shows." "That's next Friday, right?" She said, "If I decide to come back." I said, "I have a plan. Just do what you usually do and leave the rest to me." Penny's look of adoration could melt stainless steel. The party took place at the Eau Claire Golf and Country Club. Despite all the maneuvering, the journey there took about 20 minutes. There was applause as we walked in, holding hands. Penny was a celebrity, so she was taken away to mingle with the Dam Society matrons. They were all chirping to meet her. I was amused by the desperate look Penny gave me as she was dragged away to be adored. My local neighbor was in this group. Given her self-proclaimed status as a friend of sorts, she took Penny and me. Now I knew how movie star husbands felt. I was the invisible man. There are many advantages to being a nobody if your goal is classified information. The guy learned a lot about women in 24 hours. I was sure he was trained, so I wanted to make a list of victims before the program began. I walked over to the group of people gathered around Woods. I stood with my back to their group, sipping a good Cabernet and acting like I was admiring the view. I had met Woods before, but it was in passing. I knew he was an elitist pig, so I was expecting pretentious nonsense about spiritual truths. He discussed the statement about modern feminism made at the end of the play. Of course, the play was written in the 1940s and there were no big concepts of equality and freedom, just ask any minority. However, in Woods' not-so-humble view, every citizen had the right to right personal wrongs. Therefore, Penny's character did not cheat on her husband. She did what she had to do to balance the scales of justice. Woods' views on social justice did not interest me. However, I was very interested in his thoughts on retribution. I completely agreed with his views. I had some bugs that needed to be fixed, and I was going to see to it that they were all decidedly corrected. I believed my plan was more in keeping with my husband's character since he was the one being physically intimidated. I just needed to know who to bully and for how long. Meanwhile, a large group dispersed. Only Penny's partner and one other guy remained. Woods grinned and said, "I told you this would work." He laughed and said mockingly, "That trick you taught me was incredible." Her eyes rolled back. "I thought I killed her." Woods turned to the other guy and said, "We need to work on the timing for next Friday. I want the whole audience to know that what's going on is not fake. Maybe we can drag this out long enough to leave the ending in the light." The other guy must have been operating the spotlight. Woods added, "I'll show you how you can quickly lift her sweater high enough so that one of her breasts pops out. We'll work on that this week. Now I need to go hang out with these old ladies, but remember to stay after rehearsals so we can do this right. I want this arrogant to know what real humiliation is." At that moment, they all went their separate ways. He organized everything. He did this to get back at Penny, and he will pay for it. I'll show him what real humiliation is, so I'll have to deal with Woods before next weekend. He needs to understand that his plan will seriously harm his health. I sat at the bar and watched my incredible wife work the crowd. The old women admired her, their husbands openly lusted after her, and every womanizer at the party made her tempting offers. She charmed women, inflated their husbands' egos, and mercilessly rejected every advance. All this time, she winked at me with hidden glances that said, "Do you see these people?" She communicated exactly as much as was polite. She then apologized under the pretext of being tired. This was an obvious lie. As soon as we got in the car, I said, "You were right. Woods set you up. Don't worry about him, I'll take care of him this week." She said, "Okay. I'm not going to go through this humiliation anymore." I said, "Don't worry. I'll talk to him seriously. I'll also include your scene partner in the conversation. He seems to be standing on the sidelines, but I personally owe Woods, and I plan to pay him back with interest." I had no doubt that I could convince Woods that getting involved with Penny would be a very bad idea. He only weighed about 160 pounds wet, while I was approaching 220. However, despite the question of whether I could do it, several real factors needed to be weighed. The most pressing was the fact that I had a lot to lose if I were taken away for assault, so a bar fight was out of the question. So I sat at the hotspot on Sunday night, waiting for Eva's husband, who was still running the establishment at the age of 82. Her granddaughter Brooklyn waited tables. My little 10-year-old accomplice had grown into a 19-year-old beauty. She was just like her mother, tall, blonde, with her hair parted in the middle and flowing down. She looked very similar to actress Charlize Theron. She wore tight jeans and a loose blouse. She was a real flirt with all men from 18 to 88, but she treated me like a second father. She brought me my usual cup of coffee and asked, as usual, "Jake?" Brooklyn was more of a partner in crime than my best friend's little girl, so we addressed each other as you. Her appearance gave me a brilliant idea. I said, "Do you have a minute, Brooklyn?" She gave me a serious smile and sat down opposite, pouring herself a cup of coffee. I said, "Do you know a guy named Darrell Simmons?" She gave me a look of contempt and said, "There is no one on the campus of the University of Wisconsin in Eau Claire who doesn't know this loser." I asked, "Why? What can you tell me about him?" She snorted and said, "What can I tell you? He's been studying there since the Ice Age. He's a theater student, so he probably won't be able to get a real job. He and his friends are constantly chasing everyone's skirt." She studied me with the same age-wise look that I had loved for the past 9 years and said, "Why are you asking me about him?" I took a quick glance over her shoulder and said, "I'll tell you both." As her father slid into the booth next to her, I continued, "John is a beloved figure in our forest. He is a gentle city doctor, kind and caring to everyone, but there is something deadly about him. I knew he was an Army Ranger and had done several tours in Afghanistan and Iraq, but the guy I was looking at was a family man, and he had a deep, loving connection with his daughter. In fact, their unfailing love for each other spoke volumes about his humanity. I looked at Brooke and said, "I asked your father to see if he could help me with a serious problem, but maybe you could help me too. Do you have some time for a story?" Brooke turned to her grandmother, who was sitting on a stool in front of the counter, reading the local newspaper. Brookie shouted, "Grandma, can you take the floor for a moment?" Dot looked over her reading glasses, her only concession to age, and said, "Take your time, dear." I looked at the father and daughter and thought, what a pair of steadfast allies. Then I told them the whole story without hiding anything. John stopped me a couple of times to ask questions. Brooke just sat there in disgust. Finally, she said, "Leave this idiot to me." And Mats is a defenseman for the old blue-gold hockey team destined for the NHL. He's currently Brooklyn's main partner. She said, "We'll convince this weirdo that what he's up to is a very bad idea." She grinned wickedly and added, "I could kick his 5th place myself, but Mats can do it much better." I looked at her with concern. Mats had a reputation as an NHL-level fighter. I desperately said, "Don't overdo it. He should be on stage next Friday and Saturday." Brooke looked thoughtful, the wheels were already turning in her head. She reflected, "This weirdo has been following me since I arrived on campus. Maybe I'll let him take me somewhere secluded." She smiled as if enjoying the thought and said, "I don't need witnesses." I said, "It definitely has to happen before the weekend." Brooke grinned and said, "Don't worry." She stood up and said, "I need to get back to work." She then gave us a secret wink and added, "We'll make sure he doesn't have any visible injuries. I wouldn't want him to miss the show." She finished with an angry nod and returned to relieve her grandmother. I looked at John. He said, without any emotion, "The apple doesn't fall far from the tree." I didn't even want to think about what that meant. We spent the next half hour strategizing. I knew Woods would go to the authorities if we did anything that left a trace, but that wouldn't stop us from threatening to do so. John looked at me with his powerful, confident eyes and said, "We need to lure him into our territory." I understood what he was talking about. This was Sun Tzu's basic strategy. The idea was to isolate your prey and separate them from their support system. We wanted him to feel as helpless as Penny did when she was alone on stage. I said, "If we approach the jerk on the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire campus, it will be familiar to him and he will know where to go for help. But if we lure him here to our territory, he won't know where to go for contact." John said, "How do you propose to do this?" I said, "Good question. The people from Eau Claire think it's the middle of nowhere. You'd never get an FB like Woods to come here unless he had a good reason." We thought for a while. John suggested several ideas, such as a business proposal or perhaps an invitation from someone important. None of these ideas sounded plausible. I'm not a venture capitalist, and neither John nor I know anyone important. Then it dawned on me. I had the perfect bait and a great actress to sell the story. I said, "Don't worry. I can get him here. How about Wednesday at 7 p.m.? John smiled as sinisterly as his daughter and said, "We'll be convincing." Penny was preparing dinner when I arrived. I said, "Sorry I'm late, but I needed to stop at the hot spot to talk to John. We need you to do something for us." She asked, "What?" She was leaning over to take a cupcake out of the oven when she asked this. She was wearing sweatpants and a Badger t-shirt. She sat down opposite me, looking as graceful and self-sufficient as a cat. I said, "John and I need you to get Ron Woods to come to the Hot Spot Bar on Wednesday at 7 p.m. That's the day you don't have rehearsal, right?" She nodded and asked the obvious question, "Why the hell do you want me to do this?" I said, "There were some things I didn't tell you. On Saturday night, I overheard while you were in the spotlight. They're planning an even more embarrassing stunt for your next show. He wants to humiliate you in front of 300 people. He thinks it will add to the message of his play. He said it would also show you what real humiliation is." I added with a sarcastic smile, "You really should have slept with him. Penny is half Irish, half Italian. It's an explosive combination." Penny looked like she was about to explode. She said, "That's it. I'm going to destroy him." I said conspiratorially, killing will reflect badly on your achievements as an actress, so let your husband do it for you. She laughed, a truly scary laugh. I added, but you need to do something for me. I need you to lure that arrogant jerk to the hot spot with your feminine wiles. She said cheerfully, where's the phone? I handed it to her, and she dialed the number. She purred, Ron, baby, I need to talk to you alone. It's important. Penny's voice sounded like she was in heat. There was frantic mumbling coming from the phone, and she spoke, no, we have to be careful. My husband is jealous. He is afraid of smart people like you. She grinned and stuck her tongue out at me. There were still unclear sounds coming from the phone, and she said, no, we need to do it here. I know the territory, it's easier for me to evade. We can meet at a local diner. I can send you directions. Some more chatter. Okay, Hotspot Cafe at 7 p.m. Then she turned to me. How is my acting? I smiled and said, brilliant. The plan was simple. Penny would sit in a booth facing the door. She would be dressed to seduce Woods. When he walked over to sit opposite her, which he would, she would smile, slip out of the booth, and I would take her place, smiling widely. John would sit down next to me. She grinned at Woods and said, see you at rehearsal. Then she walked away flirtatiously, swaying her hips. I said, let me introduce myself. We've met before, but I'm not sure if you remember me. He replied grimly, you're Penny's husband, the teacher. The tone in which he said this was intended to put me in my place. I smiled like a wolf and said, yes, that's right. And let me introduce our city doctor. His name is John. John gave him a disarming smile, which must have scared the living daylights out of him because he began struggling in the booth, screaming, help! Help! These men are threatening me. There were 8 other customers at the hot spot, plus Dot from her place behind the counter. Dot said softly, please keep your voice down, sir. You're disturbing my customers. The rest of the people looked at us indifferently and went back to their food. I pointed to the people around me and said, they're all witnesses to the fact that we're just having a friendly conversation. Everyone in town loves us, but they hate you for what you did to Penny. So John and I are the only people standing between you and the court of tar and feather. Woods began to spin around in panic. He reached for the phone and said, I'm calling the sheriff. John grabbed his hand gently, did something to Woods' elbow with his thumb, and the guy dropped the phone and screamed, I can't feel my arm. John said softly, it was your ulnar nerve. The feeling will return in half an hour or so. Now you need to calm down and listen. At this point, Woods began to cry. It was disgusting. I looked at him as if he were a small child in need of some serious upbringing. I said, how does it feel to be helpless? Penny felt the same way on stage on Saturday. I know what you're planning for this weekend, and it's much worse. So I just wanted to explain the consequences if you keep thinking about it. What are you planning? Woods looked scared. I said in a neutral tone, as if giving him directions, right now, Penny's scene partner, who actually committed the deed, is learning a painful lesson in good behavior. I added with a regretful look on my face, I'm sorry we had to be so direct with him, but time was short and we wanted to make sure he understood the consequences. Don't worry, he'll still be able to go on stage, and hopefully by then the main bruises will have healed. But that's what makeup is for, isn't it? I looked pointedly at Woods and said, now it's your turn. He turned pale, cowered in the booth, and began to struggle. John looked at him with contempt. He then raised his hand and lightly grabbed the area of Woods' neck around his collarbone. John looked at Woods and said softly, it's called the vagus nerve. Feels like you're having a heart attack, right? So please listen to Jake. He has something to tell you. I said, you have nowhere to turn for help, and there won't be one. What you're experiencing now is nothing compared to what we can do, but it doesn't have to be if you listen to reason. I stopped and looked at him carefully to emphasize my seriousness. I said, I want to see a respectful ending to the play. That's all. Is that too much? I added menacingly, if not, John and I will have a dozen indisputable witnesses who will testify that we were in a completely different place when you had a serious accident. I said in a cold accent, and I promise you that what you're experiencing now will be like a day at the spa if you or your little buddy play any tricks on my wife. I added reasonably, you really don't need to do that. Woods started bluffing, saying he didn't know what I was talking about. I said, let me be clear, if the final part of this scene lasts longer than 10 seconds, both of you will suffer painful consequences. At that moment, John grabbed Woods by the jaw with one hand and turned him so that Woods was looking straight into his eyes. John said softly, there may be consequences from which you will not recover. For a moment, John allowed something to flare at the bottom of his soul. Woods recoiled in horror and screamed. Then he nodded resignedly and said, it'll be exactly as scripted. I'll tell Darl to be respectful. I laughed and said, I don't think he'll need any more reminders to be good. Darl is probably scared for his life right now, and you should be too in the future. I had no intention of actually doing anything. We'd already made him pee in his pants, but I wanted Woods to think about it for a while longer. Penny met me at the door. She said with excitement, how did it go? I laughed coldly and said, John and I have spoken with Director Woods, and I can absolutely guarantee that he is now more committed to protecting your honor than I am. Just don't push your scene partner too hard during the last scene, because he'll be a little nervous. She kissed me deeply and said, thank you. I replied lightheartedly, Woods was a coward, but I would defend you even against the Incredible Hulk. She laughed cheerfully and said, that's not what I'm talking about. I thank you for the trust you showed me and for your willingness to believe that I belonged only to you, even though you saw otherwise on stage. Penny suddenly looked at me seriously and said, remember our first date when we met the tires on Union Terrace? Do you remember what I said about building trust, brick by brick, and how we could create an unbreakable construct of trust that way? Well, over the last 9 years, we've built it, and it will never fall, not until death do us part. I was still awake long after Penny fell asleep. I thought, I know I'm insecure, any man would be in my place with a wife as stunningly attractive as Penny. But at the same time, I believe in her. People end up together for all sorts of irrational reasons. However, a successful long-term marriage requires a lot of hard work to maintain a meaningful connection. We invested time and effort and received rewards. I accepted the fact that Penny was several rungs above me on the social ladder, but so what? She chose me, and we built a strong bond through shared camaraderie, affection, and personal understanding. I was absolutely sure that Penny would never go back on her choice. I rolled over and pulled up the blanket. I closed my eyes and fell asleep, thinking about what I always tell my teams, chances happen, but you have to take them when they come. Penny and I used ours. The stage was darkened, and then a single spotlight came on. Penny took the stage, her gorgeous face radiating love and compassion. She lay down next to her partner. The audience was silent. All you could hear was, years from now, when you talk about this, and you talk about it, be kind. She then reached out and guided his right hand to her left breast. He seemed to wince in pain as he covered her upper body. It was just a great game, wasn't it? They kissed with increasing passion as the spotlight began to dim. Then the stage plunged into pitch darkness, and the curtain slammed shut. Brooklyn was to my right, the huge Swed was next to her, John was next to him, and Eve finished the row. We all sat in amazement. Then we rose to thunderous applause. The performance was over. Penny grinned at us. I threw a red rose on a long stem at her feet. She leaned over, took it, and kissed it. The lights came on in the house, and the drama was over. What do you think of our story today? I think it took its length and an interesting plot that hooked me. What is your impression of the story? Write in the comments. Until new videos.